Well, I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to come here this evening. It's always enjoyed coming back to my hometown, and it's always a privilege to come here and visit the Jackson Madison County Library. It holds a very dear place in my heart, and this is where it's fostered my love for history for the last 50 years. And I always enjoyed getting the opportunity to come back and visit the Tennessee Room and all the work that Jack Wood and Evelyn Keene and the staff there, they do great work preserving the history of Jackson and Madison County. So this evening I want to speak with you about my latest book project. It's one I've worked on for the last 2 or 3 years, transcribing and annotating the first 2 diaries written by Robert Henry Cartmell. I've always, of course, growing up in Jackson, I was always familiar with it from reading Historic Madison, where I went to school. When I went to school at Old Hickory Academy, we actually had a 30-day course on the history of Madison County. Of course, Historic Madison was a textbook for it. So that's where that's probably where I was first exposed to the Cartmell Diaries. And of course, I was always interested in the Civil War aspect of it, how Union occupation of Jackson and all the experiences that he wrote about. So that kind of led me to begin this project. I'm hoping it's going to be the first of many volumes where I work through, transcribe and annotate the diaries of Robert Henry Cartmell. Of course, as Elaine mentioned, I've been working on the last 6 months now or so. I've been working with the Bicentennial History Committee to create a concept and a book for the bicentennial celebration that will be shared with school children and children of all ages, I've learned a whole lot about the history of our county and our city just while doing that. So as I said, the subject of my book is Robert Henry Cartmell. Really, there was nothing particularly remarkable about him. Although he had the advantages of a prosperous family, a good education, and an established farm, he was really just a hard-working farmer, cotton planter, and slave owner making his start in life in West Tennessee. What makes him worthy to be remembered, of course, are the remarkable diaries he left behind. The first 2 volumes were written when Cartmell was in his mid to late 20s. In all, there are 33 surviving volumes of the diaries. And of course, they were first used by Emma Inman Williams while she was researching her book Historic Madison, that was published in 1946. At the time, they were owned by his great-grandson, Cartmell Towns, and today they're kept at the Tennessee State Library and Archives in Nashville. And I was very fortunate in my research that the first 5 volumes of the Cartmell Diary have actually been digitized and are available to view online. And that was a tremendous help to me when I was transcribing the diaries. Robert Henry Cartmell was born in Jackson on July 27, 1828. He was the oldest son of Martin Cartmell and Jemima Alexandra Sharp. His father was a prosperous saddle maker here in Jackson and a community leader. He served as a trustee for the West Tennessee College and was a director of the Jackson branch of the Union Bank of Tennessee. Martin Cartmell's prosperity allowed him to give his son Robert a quality education at a time when publicly funded schools weren't available. He is believed to have attended Jackson Male Academy and later the West Tennessee College, also located in Jackson, where he graduated in 1847. He earned a legal degree from the Cumberland University School of Law in Lebanon, Tennessee, where he was preparing for a career as a lawyer. Unspecified health issues led him to become a farmer instead. Cartmell returned to Jackson and he married Mary Jane Baldwin from neighboring Hardeman County in 1850. She was educated herself, having attended the Methodist Conference Female Institute here in Jackson. Robert and Mary Jane would be married for 15 years and had 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters. So the Robert Cartmell farm was located off of what then was, well, what I've seen listed on the maps as the Jackson and Beach Bluff Road, which today we know as East Chester Street. He owned about 600 acres there. The farm straddled the what is now East Chester Street. Martin Cartmell had purchased the land from Roderick McIver for $6,000 in 1842, and he would sell it to, and Martin Cartmell would sell it to his son Robert for $2,000 less than he paid for it. And this is where Robert and Mary Jane began their lives together in 1850. Robert Cartmell wrote the first entry of his diary on the 1st of January, 1853, in a ledger book he purchased for 75 cents. It was meant to be a farming journal to keep track of his daily activities and the weather conditions, as well as expenses, profits, and debts from his farm. Cartmell's diaries give an important first-hand description of life in rural West Tennessee during the mid-19th century. Recent generations have moved away from the agricultural lifestyle that many of our ancestors knew well. They probably never contemplate how their food or clothing is produced. The Cartmell diaries are a reminder of that important way of life. During the first few months of 1853, the entries were fairly matter-of-fact, simply recording routine farming chores, plowing, seeding, repairing fences, and tending to the animals, as well as the condition of his crops. Then he would give a summary of what he had accomplished on the last day of every month. Gradually, Cartmell shared aspects of his personal life, much of which revolved around his family and his faith. He and Mary Jane attended the Presbyterian Church in Jackson, either riding in a horse-drawn rockaway buggy or walking the 1.5 miles to town. Work absorbed much of his time and thoughts. His social life consisted primarily of visits to members of his family. At times, he hunted squirrels, rabbits, and ducks in the Forkadere River bottoms. The diaries reveal Robert Cartmell's spiritual and thoughtful nature. He acknowledged God for the blessings given to him and his endeavors. Anniversaries and milestones were often occasions for profound thoughts about the human condition. One such entry was written on New Year's Day, 1860. We begin a new year. Time seems to fly swifter as we grow older. Childhood seems to be not far behind. Old age is certainly not far before us. Deduct infancy and the years we pass in childhood, and then the hours misspent and the time allotted to sleep. How short a time is life really? We are between an eternity behind and an eternity to come. Constantly we are approaching our final destiny. That we will reach sooner or later is as sure as we now exist. We are at best but poor, weak, and sinful creatures, though accountable. We should make every endeavor to do our duty and leave the rest to a just God. Aspects of Cartmell's personality emerge in the pages of his diary. As a spiritual man, he abstained from alcohol and scorned those who abused him. He once complained, "When will men cease drinking and acting like brutes?" It is strange, and most especially in an enlightened community in a Christian age. This world would be vastly more pleasant if everybody would act as they should. Cartmell wrote one delightful entry when he became irritated with his spouse. Mary Jane decided to make an unplanned trip with her sister-in-law and their babies on the brand new railroad and visit her sister in Hardeman County. I don't know who went with them, Cartmell wrote. I could not leave myself at this time, and as Mary Jane was determined upon going, just at the present time, urgent business doubtless. Mary Bond, I guess, wanted to travel, and it being 40 miles through the most picturesque and beautiful country, surrounded by the most sublime scenery, she, of course, is excusable. Often Robert would preface his thoughts for the future with the somber stipulation, "If I live." At first I thought this was a pessimistic outlook, but then I learned a little more about his life, which had already by his mid-20s experienced the loss of many loved ones. In addition to the death of his sister at a young age, he and Mary Jane would lose 4 babies over the course of their 15-year marriage. Robert Cartmell thought of himself as something of a historian. During the period of 1853 to 1860, he recorded local events and occurrences such as fish fries, funerals, and political rallies. He described people gathered at the public square watching the whirling motion of a tornado on November 7, 1857, that destroyed buildings on the farm of Samuel McClanahan, 2.5 miles southwest of Jackson. He wrote about the completion of the Mississippi Central and Tennessee Railroad to Jackson and the arrival of the first passenger train on August 28, 1857. The railroad would give planters in Madison County a faster way to transport their cotton bales to markets in Memphis and New Orleans, instead of relying on flatboats navigating the Forked River. Both the Mississippi Central and the Mobile and Ohio railroads would transform this agricultural community from reliance upon the river into a vibrant railroad hub, especially after the Civil War. The most sensational and tragic event that Cartmell described took place on February 3rd, 1859. This was, he wrote, there was committed in Jackson the most cold-blooded murder I ever heard of, certainly the most awful that ever occurred in this community. The local Union Bank of Tennessee branch was robbed of $25,000 in paper money and gold coins. The clerk, 28-year-old Georgie Miller, was found murdered, having been struck over the head with a heavy check-canceling hammer. Miller had allowed someone to come into the bank after hours, presumably someone he knew and trusted. Cartmell walked into town every day for the latest news. There is a gloom cast over this community, he wrote 2 days later. To think that such a crime has been committed in their midst, and in all probability by one who has stood high. For I cannot believe that George Miller could have been induced to have gone into the bank to give a check to anyone but such a one. Cartmell also wrote, "May the future soon unravel all, and may justice be meted out full and ample to a wretch so lost to every feeling of morality and justice." Although a suspect was arrested and subsequently released, the culprit was never apprehended and the crime was never solved. If you would like to learn more about this crime, please read Thomas Aude's interesting book, Gold is the Key. When Robert Cartmell began farming on his own in 1853, he wanted to be free from debt as quickly as possible. He wrote on July 24, 1854, "I want to get in that situation that will enable me to say I owe no man, and then one of my rules will be never to go so far into debt as to be in a perfect strain to meet it, and perhaps have to borrow some. A man can't feel and be independent in that situation." Cotton was the cash crop that would bring him closer to his goal. It was a path many planters in Madison County took as well. 15,823 bales had been produced there in 1850, the 5th highest yield in West Tennessee. I am perfectly aware that I am not farming to or on the proper plan to live anything like easy or comfortable or to do justice to my ground, he wrote. But my anxiety to get out of debt prompts me to make the most I can of cotton. Cotton was a challenging crop, especially in Madison County, which was on the northern edge of the cotton belt. Its rich alluvial soil was favorable for the crop, but the weather was susceptible to cold spells and frosts. Cartmell wrote about his quandary on the 1st of September, 1855. "Rained several times this evening. If the weather continues as it has been, goodbye to cotton. It is already immoderately large. Last year 'twas immoderately small. This is no cotton country. When we make a good crop, it is so late before we can get to picking that we have to save it from the cold, bad weather." At a time when flatboats were the only way planters could get their cotton to market before the railroad reached Jackson, Cartmell lamented, "We have no communication with the rest of the world except by wagons, and there is nothing but cotton that will bear transportation. With soaring crops and heavy taxes, it is an uphill business." The workforce that Cartmell needed to achieve his goal of financial independence was enslaved labor. The slave schedule for the 1850 census recorded that he owned 27 slaves, yet he counted only 12 field hands, 7 males and 5 females, when he began farming on his own 3 years later. By 1860, he had about the same number working on his farm. He oversaw their work in the fields himself, employing an overseer for only 1 season. When it came time to pick cotton between September and March, Cartmell recorded meticulously their totals in his diary. He drew a table on each page, listing the individual and the weight they picked that day. Pickers included men, women, and older children. They averaged 86.20 pounds of cotton per day between 1853 and 1860. Fortunately, Cartmell recorded enough information in his diary about the 25 enslaved people on his farm that I was able to create short biographical sketches of each one. I felt it was important to acknowledge them as individuals for the work they accomplished on the Cartmell farm. 7 years after he started on his own, Robert Cartmell had made his farm profitable. He had expanded his acreage from the original 600 his father had sold him up to 755 acres by 1859. It was valued at $10,000, or about $321,000 today. The farm had 20 draft animals, 75 swine for pork, and 40 sheep for producing wool. He had harvested 1,500 bushels of corn and 60 bales of cotton. Improvements he made to the farm included a new cotton gin, a gin house to store it, and a press for baling his cotton on site. Prospects for the next planting season in 1861 looked bright and promising. But foreboding clouds were looming over the country. There was division between North and South over the existence of slavery that threatened to tear the nation apart. Cartmell believed the federal government had, quote, no authority to meddle with the domestic affairs of the state. He feared what he believed to be the anti-slavery extremism of the upstart Republican Party and their desire to subjugate the South. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in November 1860 confirmed these fears. We are hovering over a volcano ready to burst at any moment, he predicted. He felt that the only recourse for the southern states was to leave the Union. On New Year's Eve of 1860, he wrote, "The event of events causing the most intense feeling is the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidential chair of these United States. The South had no disposition to submit to his election. The clouds grow larger and blacker. To remain under it seems suicidal. They rather think it best to get from under it." Everything that Robert Cartmell had achieved to make his farm profitable between 1853 and 1860 would be ravaged by the Civil War. It would be occupied and decimated by Union troops. His slaves would leave him. His 2-story home would be burned to the ground. His youngest brother would never return home from the Confederate Army. His father would die. So too would his infant son, and then his wife, Mary Jane. But this is the story that I will continue in the next volume of the Cartmell Diaries. Thank you very much.
We'll take questions.
Does anyone have any questions? Anything they may like to ask?
When's the next volume?
Well, once I finish the bicentennial book, which I'm hoping is going to be in the next few months, then I'll get started back on it. I've already made a lot of progress. I've already transcribed 1861 to 1865. So it's transcribed, and now I'm actually going back through it a second time to make sure I didn't miss anything in my first transcription. So I'm hoping maybe by the end of 2022. That's the one I'm really looking forward to.
Hey, how was the diary written? Was it with a pencil or a pen? Or?
A pen. It was written by pen. The ledger books they weren't legal size, but they were close to it. I had a chance. I tried as much as I could to utilize the digital scans that were available online, because it allowed me to magnify and really get close to words that were a little more difficult to read otherwise. So I would use that, and then I used the microfilm copy that was produced in the 1970s as a backup for that, where the document, where the edges had become frayed and chipped, and sometimes there were words, and sometimes an entire line at the top or the bottom of the page would be missing. So I used the microfilm as sort of the next step. And then if all else failed, then I looked at the original diaries, but not, I guess I tried to utilize them as little as possible, just because of how fragile they are.
I was wondering how hard it was to read.
Cartmell's handwriting, fortunately, is very legible, especially during between the 1853 to 1865 period. I've done a little bit of work further, and there are periods. Now, I will take that back. Around 1863, he really tried to squeeze as much room on the paper as he could. Right. So you get lines that are really almost on top of one another. So that was a little challenging.
Hurry sometimes?
Maybe.
Under pressure to get it down real quick.
Maybe. Yeah, because he, of course, between 1860, he returned from serving in the Confederate Army, I believe, in October 1862, and his farm was already occupied by federal troops. So once he came home, he was already a target. He was arrested very briefly and then released back. But yeah, they stayed on his farm almost a year before the evacuation, before the federal troops evacuated and went south. But it's fortunate that with as much that was taken from him, the farm, the house, his house was burned to the ground, yet the diary survived. So that, obviously they meant a lot to him.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Did he have expressed any feelings regarding the transition from the flatboats to the train when the train came in?
Not that I don't believe so. It was more that he did record the first time that the train arrived in Jackson. He recorded that event because I believe he had a newer horse that he was just bringing into town, and he was in a buggy, and the horse became excited by the crowd and was acting up, I guess. He made a note of that, but I guess he didn't go into. Yeah, he didn't really go into how much better this made it for him. It was just like, it definitely made a difference because that, later that year when the railroad was there, he was able to just haul, instead of hauling his cotton bales to the flatboats and making that journey there, he just took them all to the depot.
So then he could just pay for loading them on the train to get them.
Yeah, just paid for the freight to get it to. I think it seemed like he was shipping to Memphis. Or I think earlier he did send cotton to New Orleans, but around 1853-54 during that period. But for the most part, it seemed like he was sending it to Memphis. Anything else? Yes.
What issue is missing, and what's the time frame, and then when did he stop writing?
He wrote all the way through to almost to his death in 1915. So there's 33 volumes. The one that's missing is for the period of I believe it's midway through 1867 and maybe up to around 1886, I believe. So I think there's roughly a 10-year period that's missing. I have a theory as to what it is. I think Thomas Hall was trying to share that with me. He had a theory too, but he wouldn't share it with me. When he was working on Golden's Key. My theory is that at that time, he got into an altercation with the former sheriff of Madison County, John Woolfolk, and threw a brick at him and killed him.
Oh.
And that was something I was not aware of, but it was during but he went on trial for it, and he was acquitted of it. I've tried to go back through just for curiosity's sake, because I'm not at that point in the diary yet, but I just to try to find court records and things, and there's some, but not a lot of detail, at least that I've discovered yet. That's my theory, that I don't know if was missing on accident, or because that period, that diary would cover that period of when that altercation took place, the trial itself. But that's purely my guess. I don't know. I've actually been in touch with his great granddaughter, Jane Cartmell, and I actually, she at one time she shared some photos with me from the family that didn't make it into this first volume. But she said, "Oh, and I also have this ledger book," and it perked my interest, because I thought, what if that was the missing diary? And then what it turned out to be, she looked at it, and it turned out to be he was, as I mentioned, he was something of a historian, and he felt like he wanted to collect bits of newspaper articles and things that were of interest to him. And it was a book, like it was a scrapbook essentially. So I thought, oh, wouldn't that have been great to find that missing volume, but that's my theory anyway. I don't. I guess it's more of a hypothesis.
Your books, what are your books selling for?
They are. It's $35 plus tax. I'm sorry, this is my wife Cindy. I didn't introduce her at the beginning of my presentation. She's from Waverly. Of course, Waverly's been in the news quite a bit lately, so she's been helping with flood relief down there. But she's my bookkeeper. I write the books. I research the books. I write the books, and she helps sell the books. She keeps the accounting.
She's your marketing director.
Yes. She's my best salesperson.
They're $38.41 with tax.
And I also have a few of Mr. Aulet's books as well that I had in case anyone was interested in his.
I remember one day I came in and he goes, "What does that look like?" And I said, "Blood." And he goes, "Good." Okay, that's gonna be a good one.
Trying to use my creativity.
What's your home, Mr. Rowley?
Our house in Waverly is up on a hill and we're okay. Ours is fine, but when you see what everybody else has lost, it is like you almost feel guilty that you're good. Over 500 people were displaced, 500 homes. I think 272 of them are total loss, have to be bulldozed down. So there's a lot of hurt going on. A lot of people lost a lot of animals. A lot of people lost family. So it was bad. It was really bad. It looks like a war zone in Waverly right now. And last night there was a big benefit, and so hopefully a lot of money was raised. I worked a concert for that at the Opry, and hopefully they're going to get some help soon. Most of them didn't have flood insurance, so yeah, it's
Never dreamed that was gonna happen.
What happened was the railroad, the little creek that runs through town, which is normally a dry creek, it had a bunch of debris that clogged up underneath the bridge, and the railroad ran parallel straight through the town, and behind it was some low areas, and that formed like a lake. When that broke through the levee, so the railroad was like a levee, it was like a dam, and when it broke through, it just was like a 10-foot wall, like a tsunami that hit the town. And that's why all the houses were moved off the foundation and stuff. So it's bad.
That bad.
Sorry.
Your book about Fieldinghurst, is he really as bad as we've heard over the years?
Yes and no. And I say that because he wasn't he was a bad person. I don't think I would have wanted to be friends with Hearst. But I think a lot, the legend is kind of makes him more of a demon, a devil than he really was. And it's interesting because I wrote my book, Hearst's Worst, I believe, I published it in 1997. And since then, actually, my business partner, John Talbot, we discovered diary of his, from his second in command of the 6th Tennessee Cavalry. And John actually transcribed that diary, and we learned a lot of information about what Hearst was doing, and John did a really good job of disproving some of the legends that he killed people and cut their heads off and had them put on spikes in his front yard, that sort of thing. I mean, he disproves that, because it turns out all the people that were allegedly murdered all survived the war. And so
Okay.
that's research that's come out since my book came out. So
Okay.
his book's called In the Shadow of the Devil. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.